Today we have Liz Shields, who is the head of KIND here in Houston, Kids in Need of Defense, which is Children in Immigration. And Liz, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and so probably throughout the lunch people will be joining as well. So I think we had 15 to 20 people RSVP. And of course Telemundo is here filming us as well. So first off, I guess I want to ask you personal background. So what brings you to doing this sort of work that you're doing?
Sure. I am from Liberty, Texas. It's just northeast of Houston, for those of you that may not be familiar with this little tiny town. Growing up, I was really interested in immigration issues. I couldn't tell you exactly why. I have some theories, like retrospectively, but that's not that important. When I went to law school, I spent 2 semesters in the immigration clinic here at U of H. And I loved it. It just felt like a really good fit. I was particularly interested in issues that impacted women and children. And so I decided that the next step for me would be to try and find a way to use my law degree to advocate for women and children. I moved to Washington, D.C., and I took a position with the Women's Refugee Commission. And basically the first thing I was tasked with was helping out with a report on detention standards for children, which was fascinating to me. I didn't really know about what I now know very, very well, what an unaccompanied child was. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the term, an unaccompanied child is a child who's under the age of 18 who enters the U.S. without a parent or a legal guardian who's able to provide care and protection for that child. So there's all these regulations that exist about how we can actually detain unaccompanied children when they enter the country, how we have to treat them. And one of the first tasks I had was working on that report. Well, it was a great position, but through that position I met someone named Chris Nugent, who in the immigration world is a giant.
Where does he live?
Chris is in Washington, D.C. Chris at the time was running a program at the law firm of Holland & Knight, which they had a community services team that was dedicated to immigration issues. And I met Chris, and he offered me a job at Holland & Knight. So what I thought was going to be a quick stint in D.C. then turned into more, and I found myself working at a law firm, but doing pro bono work for the law firm, which was really, really cool because we were able to take on these huge cases and throw resources at them that the firm had, and that was my job. So all I was billing was pro bono work. So I did that for about a year, and one of the things that Chris was also working on was this new nonprofit, Kids in Need of Defense. Ironically, one of the things I did while I was working at Holland & Knight was go and look for office space for KIND. You know, I had no idea I was later going to work for KIND, but he was very involved in the planning and the startup of the organization, and so he actually suggested that I apply for a position to open up one of their offices. And I did. At the time I interviewed for a position in both Houston and in Baltimore, and ultimately ended up taking a position in Baltimore. Life has led me back to Houston. So that was in 2009. And now here we are in 2017, and I'm here in Houston working out of our Houston office.
And I know you went to Liberty High School, and then you went to Rice undergrad at U of H, and then you went to DC before you came back. When you look at the landscape in Texas of immigration, and sort of maybe people's perceptions of immigration, it seems to me that it's changed a lot. Like I remember when George W. was the governor of Texas, and he was, in a sense, very immigration friendly, right? He was very different than maybe it currently is. How have you seen that affect the work that you're doing?
I mean, it's interesting to have worked in 2 very different environments. So, I mean, I was in Baltimore for many years, and Maryland, as a state, is a very immigrant-friendly state. There are so many policies in place to be a welcoming state. Whereas here in Texas, it's a little bit different. Yeah. I think working in Houston specifically is odd because Harris County is a very immigrant-friendly place, but people are really diametrically opposed when it comes to immigration here. And it's interesting to me because we are such a diverse city, but there is certainly a lot of backlash that we receive. And I was on Houston Matters quite some time ago, and in response to being on the radio show, I got this interesting email from a listener about how we as kind, by providing protections for unaccompanied children, are feeding into the trafficking of unaccompanied minors.
Oh,
and,
yes.
just what a horrible organization we are, and it's a conspiracy that we're trying to help
Based on alternative
these
facts.
children. Right, exactly. Yeah, and I can say that in the 7 years I spent in Baltimore, I never received that sort of email. There were definitely people that felt differently about the work that we do than I did, but I didn't feel the same sort of hate that we felt since coming back to Texas.
When you think about children, immigrant children coming to Texas, and you and I have talked about this, but for the sake of our group here, why are children being unaccompanied, or why are they coming with, very young children coming with their families, and they're not from Mexico?
Right.
So why are they coming?
So they're kids here from the Northern Triangle, so Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And they're coming here because they're seeking protection. They're essentially refugees. They're coming here because they're being recruited by gangs. They're being targeted by gangs. They're being abused by their caretakers in home country. They're coming here because they're afraid they're going to die in their home country. They're not coming here because they want better economic opportunities. When Dr. Bob and I were talking about a week or two ago, and I shared a story of a 3-year-old boy whose mother actually made arrangements for him to come to the United States. The child's father was murdered by gangs, and she was afraid that her 3-year-old son was going to face the same circumstances. So she actually tried to do things the right way. She met with a woman who she thought was an attorney, who gave her this plan of how they were going to get her son to the United States, and he had family members in the United States who he was going to join when he got here. But it turns out this woman was not a lawyer. She was a smuggler. Most of the children we work with actually come here with the help of a smuggler. We call that person a coyote. And while the young boy was in Mexico, he was kidnapped and held for ransom for a number of months until his mother could actually pay to have him come over. He was apprehended at the border and ended up in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and eventually in my office, and so we were serving him. But when I think back to that story, I'm a mom. I have 3 children of my own, and I think, what must be going through her mind that she's willing to take the risk to send a 3-year-old child on that journey, knowing that things like that happen. But she was afraid for his life, so that's what you do. Most of the kids we see, as I say, do come with a smuggler, so they either have to borrow money and pay very high fees to these smugglers to help them, or they have a debt to smugglers. So they get here in the United States and they do need to work because they need to pay off that debt to the person who helped them get here, and they're very afraid of what will happen if they don't pay off that debt. But the other thing that I've seen that's been a disturbing trend over the years is a real increase in the amount of money that children are paying, and an increase in the number of stories of children who are victimized again on the journey.
So I was talking with Bill Bernstein, who is the head of Mosaic up in North Texas, and they worked with a lot of these unaccompanied children and young children, and he was saying that a lot of them, when they come, maybe most of them actually already have family here. Is that sort of what you're finding?
That's absolutely true. Yeah, I mean, what member of their family varies. A lot of the children that we see that are from El Salvador have parents who are living in the United States who have what's called temporary protected status. So these are people who have been living here for quite some time. They have work authorization. The government knows they're here legally. However, that status that they have is not a status that their children can derive any benefit from. So they can't bring their children here, but they're here legally. So we have that subset of the population. We also have a lot of children who might have other family members who are here in various types of status. Maybe they're undocumented. Maybe they have legal permanent residency through some other form. Or maybe since they've come, they've received asylum or some other benefit. So most of the children that we see, even though they enter and they're unaccompanied, they don't have a parent or legal guardian, it doesn't mean that there's not someone here. It may be that they're with a sibling or a distant cousin, but most of them do end up with some family member.
Talk a little bit about numbers. How many kids are we talking about that come into our country every year about?
So when I started doing this work in early 2007, I guess, working with unaccompanied children, we would see, and in 2009, we would always say 7,000 to 9,000 unaccompanied children are coming into the country every year. And I would give this caveat that that's the number of children who are apprehended. The number could actually be much higher. In fiscal year 2014, the number of unaccompanied children who were then released was at almost 60,000. So there's a couple of different numbers that go out there, and I was looking at this before I came. And so I want to give it the disclaimer that 60,000 is the number of unaccompanied children who were then released. It doesn't account for unaccompanied children who were apprehended at the border, who then were immediately returned, or who stayed in government custody because there wasn't someone who was able to care for them. So 60,000 in fiscal year 2014. There was a slight decline in 2015, and then an increase again in fiscal year 2016. And then this year, as of the end of March, I'm looking down because I have the number written down, 34,318 unaccompanied children.
At the end of March.
As of the end of March for this fiscal year.
So this may beat everyone.
Right, we don't know. I mean, we'll have to see. The numbers have been down.
And the numbers are lower in the summer anyway, right?
Right, that's absolutely correct, yeah. And the numbers have been down for the last couple of months, and there's a lot of factors there. One is the time of year. Numbers are down because of the time of year. Two is the new administration. We don't know what impact that's having. And I was also talking to Dr. Bob about this previously. One big change we saw with unaccompanied children in 2014 also was that children started to actually present themselves to immigration when they crossed, because they knew that they were going to be treated well, there was going to be some form of protection. But I think that's shifted too. Now children
they're not turning themselves in this quickly?
Right, exactly, because they're afraid of what's going to happen. They don't know. We have all these executive orders, and we know we have President Trump, who is not the most immigrant-friendly president. So people are afraid, right? So I think that there probably is a decrease of children coming, but I also think that that's probably a factor that might be impacting things as well. They're riding on top of trains through these countries. La Bestia, exactly. Exactly. That happens less than it did for a while, because most of that trip is through Mexico, and the Mexican government has been trying to crack down on immigration. They have their own immigration issues. But, a large part of that journey is really just children walking, children traveling on their own. In large groups, maybe, but, not with people that they necessarily know.
And so when they reach the United States, we know that most of them are, have turned themselves in, and haven't been on the border. We see they go, if they're with their family, they go through the Catholic Charities Center there in McAllen, and then they're quickly put on a bus to a city where their relative is. But take us through that process.
So that's what happens with children who are arriving with parents, right? Those are, we call them AWCs, adults with children. So our population, unaccompanied children, it's a little bit different. When they're apprehended, first they're interviewed by Border Patrol, and then they're actually transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of Health and Human Services. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement is tasked with providing shelter for these children until an appropriate sponsor can be identified. So what is a sponsor? A sponsor is not someone who has any sort of legal standing on the child's behalf. It's not like a guardian. It's a person who comes forward and signs an agreement with the government, basically, that they will allow this child to stay with them. They'll ensure the child goes to all of his or her immigration hearings. And basically they'll care for the child until the child's immigration court case is complete. Now, not surprisingly, a lot of these sponsor relationships fall apart, but there's not any way to get a new designated sponsor through ORR, not at this point in time. And who can a sponsor be? A sponsor can really be anyone. While the child's in ORR care, the shelter starts basically calling all the numbers that the child provides. So, if the child has an immediate relative in the United States, that's certainly the preference. But it could be a very distant family friend that the child's never met before, has no, previous relationship with. Other things that happen while the child's in ORR care. So an ORR facility is really like a group home setting. It's not a baby jail. When we hear about baby jails, and I know there's been a lot of press about that recently, we're really talking about something different. We're talking about those children who are arriving with their families. ORR facilities are more or less, happy places for these kids, and for a lot of these kids, because they're coming here.
Have they changed from the beginning? Because at first there were a lot of stories about
that.
They have
certainly changed. Yeah, they have certainly changed, and there are some that are really horrific as well. But they've certainly improved over the years. And again, in my early career, one of the things I did was look at some of these facilities and go to some of the bad ones, right? but they've certainly improved over the years. The last facility that I was in here in Houston, there's bunk beds in the room, there's art up on the walls, they have a common space where there's games and things that the children can do. There's different levels of ORR facilities as well. So most children are in just general facilities, but there's also staff secure facilities. So if there's concerns about a child's safety, if he was a former gang member in home country, he would go to a staff secure facility. And so that is a jail basically.
Yeah.
But most of these kids actually feel really safe and protected in the ORR facility, and sometimes they say they want to go back. I mean, for many of them, it's the first time that they've received medical care. It's the first time they're able to go to school, and they're surrounded by Central American kids. Everyone speaks Spanish. Everyone has similar stories, and they're all survivors of trauma because they've all come here fleeing something, and so all of a sudden they're getting all the support that they've never had before. So they stay in those facilities generally for about a month. That's what we're seeing for the amount of time before they're released to someone. And then they go wherever that sponsor is. So if that sponsor is here in Houston, they come here. Also, since for this fiscal year, Houston has seen 4,364 released unaccompanied children. That's the most children in any state with the exception of California. So we've been neck and neck in terms of which states receive the most unaccompanied children since the surge. In 2014, when we saw the highest number of unaccompanied children, Texas did receive the most of those kids then, but it's been very close to California.
So how many in Texas? You said 4,000?
4,364 in Houston, and in Texas, I'd have to double check the number.
So,
the Office of Refugee Resettlement, if anyone's interested, these are public. It's public data. You can look it up, and you can look by state, and you can also break it down by county.
And of those 4,000, how many is kind defending?
So we have about 600 open cases right now at different levels. We're a staff of 15 at the moment. We have two different components to our office. We have our attorneys who are dedicated to providing representation, direct representation to kids who are staff attorneys. But the other portion of those cases we farm out to pro bono attorneys. So one of the things that I do when I'm not coming here talking to Dr. Bob is I go out to law firms and I talk to attorneys and train them on how to represent an unaccompanied child. Who is an unaccompanied child? What have these children been through? And what can you do as a lawyer to help them? And then once an attorney is interested and takes on a case through our organization, we have a subset of our staff that are dedicated to providing support and mentorship to those children so that we can make sure that their cases are successful.
So you're obviously not taking on all 4,000. So what's happening if you take on 600, 800? What's happening to all the other kids?
Right, so most of those kids don't have an attorney. I mean, here in Houston, we're fortunate that we have Kind and Catholic Charities who are both funded to provide representation for unaccompanied children. We're both part of what's a universal representation model, which means that we're taking children despite their eligibility for relief. We believe that all children should have legal representation regardless of whether or not they can stay in the United States. It's just a basic due process issue for us, right? But other parts of the state don't have those sorts of initiatives, and we, Kind or Catholic Charities, neither of us have the capacity to serve all of these children. So most of them, you'll see them at court. You can go down to immigration court any day of the week. There are open public dockets, and you can watch. You can watch an unaccompanied child docket, and you'll see children go before the court that have no representation. And they don't know what to do. It's a proceeding that is, people have compared immigration law to tax law because it's so complicated. And so not only is it a complicated law, but it's a proceeding that's in a different language. It's, there's a government attorney who can cross-examine these children. It's a hostile environment for these kids. And I just have to throw this out here, they're kids.
Yeah. And are those kids most likely to be sent back?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, what happens in theory is, if you don't qualify for relief, you have the option of requesting what's called voluntary departure. So you can ask the court, basically, to send you back to your home country. You have to prove that you have the means to do it, you have to prove that you have a travel document, and that you actually have the intent to return to your country. And I'll say that's something that varies in different parts of the country too. When I was in Baltimore, we had a court that was very excited about voluntary departure, but here in Houston, I mean, that standard is taken pretty seriously. So if you're a 10-year-old child and you have one parent here in the United States and you don't have a travel document, the court's not going to grant you voluntary departure, even if you want to go back, because you have to prove that you can actually submit documentation to return. So if you don't ask to
So what do they do?
they receive a removal order, which is the same thing that would happen if they didn't go to court. If you miss a court hearing, you get an order of removal. So the government issues them a letter that says you are being removed. One of the things that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about is what happens when you receive a removal order. So for these kids, they're not in detention, right? These are kids who are walking around among us. So the government doesn't re-detain these children and put them on a plane. When they receive a removal order, what they actually get is what we call a bag and baggage letter. So they're expected to present themselves at an airport, to get on an airplane, to be removed in home country. And what happens next? So this is also kind of shocking, and I was speaking at a different lunch yesterday, and this was really sort of a job dropper for folks. When you get to the other side, when you arrive in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras, and you get off that airplane, there's nobody there. It's not like there's a welcoming committee for children who are deported. You are all of a sudden in a major city in the country that you're from, and there's no one, there's no support there. One of the initiatives that KIND has, we have a reunification program. We actually do a lot of regional work, and we have a return and reintegration program, which is in collaboration with the Guatemalan government. So for a number of years, we've been helping children from Guatemala who are either voluntarily departing or have removal orders who are returning to Guatemala. We help them, and we work with folks on the ground in Guatemala so that there is someone to pick up that child when they arrive and that they receive some sorts of services. We recently started the same program with the Honduran government. We don't serve every child who's from either of those countries. It's only children who are reunifying or returning to certain regional areas, because those are the areas where we have partners currently on the ground, but we're hoping to expand that regional work as well. And also, using that as a research tool to find better ways to provide support for kids who are returning.
I was moderating a panel on labor trafficking on Monday night at the Holocaust Museum. And a woman stood up and one of the things she talked about was the governor's sanctuary city and how she was supportive of it, and that we should be following the law, and law enforcement cities should be following the law. How has that, all of that sort of affected you, and what are your thoughts on it?
Sure.
Just inside this cone of silence here. So.
Well, I mean,
Put the news camera on.
So I also kind of lump that into the executive orders and what's happened after these executive orders have been issued, because it's all related, right? What we've seen the most of is just what we call in our office is culture of fear. People are afraid. I'm sure many of you saw the Houston Chronicle article that came out not too long ago about the low numbers of immigrants reporting crime. So like the number of rapes in the Hispanic community is down significantly, but the reality is that it's not that it's down, it's that reporting is down, right? So,
yeah.
Exactly, yeah, people are afraid, and I think that's definitely increasing. I understand the argument that people should be following the law, but here's what happens in reality, and here's a really good example. So a couple of weeks ago, we're working with a mom, we're not working with a mother, we're working with 3 children who live with their mom here in Houston who is undocumented. And she, like many of the children that we work with, lives in what we call a mixed status home. So there are a lot of people in the house. Some of them have legal status, many of them don't. And one person in that house has a prior removal order and possibly some sort of criminal issue. We're not really sure. He's not the caretaker of these children. He just happens to be an uncle who lives in the same house. So law enforcement came to the house. They'll become legal permanent residents. But what happened while law enforcement was there? Well, they asked mom about her status, and she doesn't have anything to prove she has status because she doesn't. So mom ends up getting apprehended and is currently detained in a facility here in Houston.
Even though she hasn't broken the law?
Even though she hasn't broken the law, except for the fact that she did enter the country without proper authorization. The 3 boys who have an attorney and who have pending immigration cases, one of them had his cell phone out, and they looked at his cell phone and saw a picture of this boy and one of the brothers presumably smoking pot. I have questions about how they know that's what he was smoking or doing in the picture, but he's detained, so we don't know. So these 3 brothers also get picked up, and now they're all detained because the 3 brothers don't have anyone to be released to because their sponsor, who they're released to, is detained. So, we're seeing issues where families, there's all this collateral damage to the families, and that's really concerning to me. These kiddos didn't do anything. Their mom came over here because, it's not important why she came over here. I don't actually know the reasons why she came over here initially. But because of this focus on enforcement, what we're really doing is, creating situations where we're just breaking apart families.
Yeah. Liz, as you look at everything that's going on with immigration and children, I mean, if you could change some things, what are some of the things that you would like to see changed that
Right.
government policy?
Number one on my wish list is appointed counsel for children in immigration proceedings. I don't think any child should have to go through immigration court proceedings by themselves. And again, for me,
if you're an American child and you break the law, do you always have
in the criminal
attorney?
context, yes, you're
Yes.
appointed an attorney. You get a public defender. I think the same should happen in the
But the
immigration
difference is that these
context.
aren't American kids, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, I would say that the consequences are much higher here because a lot of these kids, it's not that they're facing jail time, they're facing death, right?
Are there enough pro bono attorneys, if it were well coordinated, that all these kids could get representation?
I mean, that's a great question.
You'd have to fund the
You'd have to
coordination.
fund it, right? And potentially there's tons of attorneys out there. Ideally, I think the best model would be a mix of pro bono attorneys and
Yeah.
also attorneys who are dedicated to doing this work. Why? Because some cases are more complicated than
Yeah.
others, and
Does any state have?
So, New York has a pilot project,
Mm-hmm.
which is locally funded to provide representation for all of these kids. And, representation at this point in the project is limited. So, what they do is basically they have attorneys who are at court all the time, who are at least able to screen those kids. And so they can go to the judge and say, even if they're not entering an appearance, they can say, I've met with this child. I recommend the child seek counsel. Basically let the court know this child qualifies for something. And, there have been sort of ad hoc implementations of that too in other parts of the country. So when I was in our Baltimore office, we had a program that was actually funded by the Department of Justice, and we had a couple of attorneys who were basically, in a sense, public defenders, right? But they had capacity issues. There were only a couple of them. But that was something that they would also do. They would do screenings at the court and then, take cases directly from the court when children qualified for relief. But even children who don't qualify for relief, they need to know what voluntary departure is, if that's an option for them, how that might impact them in the future. Because the beauty of voluntary departure is that for a very select few number of kids, it allows them to come back to the United States if there's some way for them to come back later legally. Like, say they marry someone like a U.S. citizen and they want to come back based on their citizen husband. So it's really important to understand, though, just how those things impact you.
I want to open it up to questions here in a second, but what is it that motivates you to do your work, Liz? And even maybe more importantly, we don't do this work without thinking we see light at the end of the tunnel, right? Maybe we're living in a fog and there isn't, but what is that light at the end of the tunnel for you that sort of keeps you oh, maybe this will happen?
Well, I mean, since I've started at Kind, which we opened our Baltimore office in 2009, at that time, in the Baltimore community, no one knew who an unaccompanied child was. And we also didn't know we were going to see this huge surge in 2014.
Right.
But still, no one knew who an unaccompanied child was. The court there didn't have a special docket for unaccompanied children. That was one of the things I advocated for there. But it's now something that's happening nationwide. We have specific courts that are dedicated to these kids. I do think that we're seeing a change. We're seeing more and more attorneys who are realizing that this is something that's happening, and they're stepping up. I mean, I've been really impressed with how many attorneys here in the Houston community have expressed interest of taking cases through our organization. So, change is slow, right? And I think if we have attorneys who are taking on these cases in their own free, spare time, the other thing that they're doing is they're advocating for some sort of appointed counsel because they understand the importance that being the pro bono attorney on that case makes. So then they're talking to representatives. They're making a fuss at DC that we should have better policies in place for these children. And so that's how change happens. We need to get more than just my people, the immigration
Yeah.
advocates interested in the issue. And that's, that's what keeps me going, really educating people about the issue, seeing the children that we're directly able to impact, and just knowing that all of those people who are dedicating their time to representing one child are also giving those children a voice, so that hopefully one day we will have some sort of public defender system for these kids.
Are you amazed that, I know that the day that Donald Trump signed the executive order, sort of limiting people arriving, we had immigration attorneys go to the airport. And that was sort of the biggest thing that I'd seen around immigration in a long time. I am sort of amazed that there's not more activism and outcry and outrage, certainly around children, but around immigration in general. I mean, you're immersed in it. So do you see a lot of it, or are you sort of amazed like I am?
So I'm sure I see much more of it,
Yeah,
right?
of course
I
you
mean, I feel like every other day I'm on some call about what should our response be to this?
Yeah.
How should we be handling this? It's such a big issue too. And I think there are so many people that have their specific area where they're interested in. So I mean, here in Texas right now with the immigration advocates, we're all sidetracked by SB4. What can we do about SB4? It's a particular group of us who are interested in unaccompanied children's issues. And so I think it's kind of like, where do we start? And especially with the new administration. So, there's these executive orders that Trump signed, but a lot of the impact of those orders is yet to come. So I think we're kind of waiting to see what the real impact is. So we have all of these, this is what we think is going to happen, this is what we're afraid is going to happen, here's what our response should be, here's what our proactive response right now is, but we're not really sure what to expect. So I think you're going to see a point where that changes.
Yeah, very good.
I hope so.
Questions you guys have for Liz around children and immigration? Yeah, Gail?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so I know absolutely nothing about immigration law,
But you're really smart.
some days.
Yeah.
But I come from a family where my grandmother came here at 11 with her 13-year-old sister fleeing the Ukraine. There was no question. She was a refugee because of the political situation there. We know what's going on in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala. Why are these kids not automatically considered the equivalent of coming out of a war zone and treated as refugees?
That's a fantastic question. It's $1 million question. And that's the question that I ask as well. I think it's a really complicated question. And I think part of it, truthfully, is because we're talking about countries that are right here. I mean, they're so close, and there's so many children that are coming to our borders. I think for policy reasons, we as the U.S. government, and this is just me saying this, right? But we don't want to consider all of these children refugees. My organization would say they are all refugees. They should all be receiving asylum. But, we here, particularly in the Fifth Circuit, have some really bad case law that makes it hard for them to have those claims, right? So to be considered, take asylum, for example. So a child has to be persecuted. Most of the claims you see are on account of their membership in a particular social group. So there has to be some connection to why they're persecuted. And we have case law that makes it really, really hard to make that claim. And truthfully, we have some judges that have some strong stances on those things as well.
But when you guys defend them, they're more likely than not to be able to stay.
That's true, yeah. Texas is also tough because our asylum office here in Houston also has the lowest grant rate in the country. And our courts have pretty high denial rates of asylum, but we're generally successful with our cases.
Wow. Gretchen, you had a question?
I did. Can you talk about some demographic trends? Are you seeing boys versus girls, younger, older?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the last couple of years, we've seen an alarming trend for much younger children coming. So we see a lot of 4 and 5-year-olds in our office these days. Things that you would see in all of my staff's desks are crayons and, coloring books and toys. We actually recently made a toy closet at our office because we have so many young kids. And one of the things that we've been talking about is how can we make sure in our intakes that we're finding ways to communicate with these kids to get them to tell their stories, because they are so young that we need to find other ways. So we often ask them to draw pictures of their journey. So certainly more younger children. We are seeing more females coming. We're still seeing more males, but definitely that's shifting. And then what we've seen a lot of in the last couple of years are young moms coming with infants or coming when they're pregnant.
Are the moms under 18 or? Just,
Under 18,
yeah,
right.
under
So they're
18
not, so
moms.
they're still considered unaccompanied children. Otherwise, if they were
With
over
children.
18, they would be adults with children, so.
Is one harder than the other?
You know, there's a number of special protections for unaccompanied children, so I think it is better to come under 18
Under 18,
for sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
very good. Emily, you had a question?
Yeah, hi Liz. Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you. I was just wondering, are we seeing any acceleration in the processing of the cases as of late?
So what we've been seeing, and I actually got that question yesterday from another group, we have been seeing an acceleration of cases that are filed with the asylum office. So we are seeing cases that we're finding the asylum office are getting interviews at the, however, we have cases that have been pending at the asylum office, cases we filed a year ago that still aren't getting interviews. So in every other area, we're seeing just delays. So there's delays with processing the USCIS. The courts are giving longer continuances and rescheduling our cases. So everything else seems to be slowing down, which for us, we have a large portion of our cases that are handled by pro bono attorneys. So that's really hard, because then we're also having to sell our cases to pro bono attorneys saying, we have no idea how long it's going to take to complete this case, because the process is essentially stalled at a lot of points.
Wow.
But then the kids get to stay.
Yes.
As that drags
Sure,
on.
they do. They do. I mean, you know, because they have a case that's in progress. But, you know, kids they lose hope, right? So they lose faith in the process. They lose hope. They are less likely to come to appointments at the office. There's more opportunity for them to get into trouble. And what we find is once a child actually has a green card, once they have some sort of legal status here in the United States, they really have an incentive to stay out of trouble. And they don't feel like they have to live in the shadows. So all of a sudden, like, their future gets much brighter. So the delays are really concerning for us. It makes it much harder to work with them. Sometimes we lose clients. No, we don't lose clients, but
Yeah.
we lose contact with them because of the delays in their cases.
And what happens if you think, if you're representing a child and you think they are likely to be sent back, you can't tell a child, hey, you're likely to be sent back, you should run. But do they get a sense like they should leave at some point?
So, you know, what I have done in the past, it's tough, right? Because you want to be honest. You're working with kids. I mean, I explain to kids what their options are as clearly as I can. So you can, you know, I can say, here's your case. I don't feel like it falls into the legal framework. I don't think you're going to qualify for one of these forms of relief. However, you still have a right to go forward on your case. If you lose, here's what's going to happen. If you don't show up to court, here's what's going to happen. And then just leave it with the child. And, you know,
Most of them figure
what
it out.
inevitably happens, right, is that, you know, if they have a sense that they're not going to win their case, why would they? Why would they go forward in the process? And so then the next meeting, that child is not there.
Are you seeing from your colleagues in other organizations, are you seeing much discussion around the American children of parents who are also being sort of sent home? Or
I
sent
mean,
back to
you know,
their native
for
country?
us, it's sort of a tangential issue because we're working with the unaccompanied children. But certainly we're hearing that concern from the parents of the children who we're working with who are here with the parent. Like, what's going to happen because I have two other kids who are U.S. citizens? And, you know, for us, we're not in a position to really be doing a lot of counseling to those parents.
Yeah.
But, you know, we've been talking to them because there's other organizations in Houston that are focusing more on that and family preparedness. The Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative is working a lot on family preparedness, and I think there's going to be more things coming out in the coming weeks, more opportunities for families to be able to receive assistance, because, you know, you do need to have some sort of plan in place. If you are undocumented mom and you get picked up and you get removed, and you
Yeah.
have U.S. citizen children here, I mean, what happens to those children? They're not automatically sent back with mom.
We were talking to someone recently, and he was talking about this, sort of what's happening around with children, the children of immigrants or immigrant children, and that we're creating sort of a whole generation of paranoid kids.
I think that's true, for sure.
Yeah.
I think I was telling you a story about a young man who is a DACA recipient, and he was telling a story to me.
Explain what DACA is.
DACA. So it's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So it's something that executive order by the Obama administration, which basically allows for work authorization. Basically, you're registering with the government that you're here. You have to meet a number of different requirements. You have to have been here for a particular amount of time. You have to have been enrolled in school. But a number of people in our community have benefited from DACA, and they now have work authorization. And this young man was one of those people. But he was talking about when he was a child, he remembers his mom having a conversation with him and his siblings. She didn't have legal status, but he didn't really understand that because he came here at such a young age. But she was telling him, if someone comes to the door, she said, she was talking about immigration, she said, I want you and your brothers to go out the back door, very calmly walk down the alley to the neighbor's house, and if anyone approaches you, speak to them in English. She was counseling them what to happen if she gets picked up. But he didn't understand that as a child, and then he realized as he became an adult, and when he realized that he didn't have legal status, like what was happening there. But I think that's what we're seeing on a much larger level, these kids. And not just the kids who don't have legal status, but also, the U.S. citizen kids in that family who don't know what's going to happen to their families. And, then they're faced with, do I stay in the United States where I've always lived, where I'm a citizen, or do I go with my mom or dad? And some of them are so young that they don't have that option to make that decision.
That's very interesting. Do you speak Spanish, Liz?
My Spanish is not so good. I do.
So Telemundo,
No.
Telemundo, do you have a question for us that you want us to answer from here? That you'd like?
If
But-
I can
That's my
mic you up,
Spanish.
if that's okay. If I
Or we could do it afterwards. I
We
just
can
wanted
do
to see
it
if
after.
afterwards. Okay, that sounds good. En español solamente.
Oh, no.
Oh, it's all right.
She's very good. So let me ask you sort of a few final fun questions, right? What was your favorite book growing up as a kid?
Oh my gosh, growing up as a kid. I can't remember one in particular, but I love the Nancy Drew series.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was really into mysteries.
Did you think you might want to be a detective when you grew up because of that?
Maybe.
Or maybe just when you were a
Yeah.
teenager, a detective.
Yeah.
And then go to Rice and do something else, yeah. And if you weren't, I'm going to assume you're going to be an activist no matter what, but if you weren't an activist for immigration, what would you be an activist for?
Oh gosh. Probably some other sort of social justice. I mean, kids in some other capacity.
Kids, it's like
Kids.
working at Children at Risk or
Right,
something.
yeah.
Just saying.
You have a job for me?
Every good person has a job for it. And what's your favorite thing about Houston?
I like the diversity of the city. I complain that Houston is too big, but at the same time, I appreciate that there are all these neighborhoods and communities that you can access, and I like that.
Wasn't there an article this morning that Houston is the most diverse city in America?
I didn't see that article,
Yeah,
but
so that's good. And your favorite restaurant in Houston?
Govinda's. I live in Oak Forest, and it's a vegetarian Indian restaurant, and I love it.
Govinda's.
Govinda's, yeah. So no one has checked it
Char,
out.
have you ever been there? You have. Is it good?
But it's vegetarian.
It is
It's
vegetarian.
yeah.
In fact, it's even like no garlic, no.
Oh, vegetarian, no garlic.
Vegetarian.
Yeah, but not only
So
is
it's like tasteless vegetarian.
no, it's delicious, and not only is it delicious, but the people there that own it are so nice. I think they
Oh,
know
yeah.
my husband by name now.
Are you a vegetarian yourself?
I'm not. I don't eat a whole lot of meat, but I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not a true vegetarian. I won't lie to you.
So we can
but I
meet for
am.
barbecue sometime.
I don't really
Yeah,
eat
yeah,
barbecue.
that's okay. I was-
Well, occasionally lunch meat is okay.
Very good. Any other final questions for Liz?
I did have a quick question about the sponsors that you mentioned. Do all the children get assigned a sponsor? What happens if they don't
So,
get that?
generally, we're able to identify sponsors. But if there is not anyone, then those kids are transferred to what's called URM custody. So they go into the same program that refugee minors would go into. So they stay in government custody.
Oh, that's nice.
No.
So if it's not a parent or a family member, they will automatically go with the government?
They could go to the, yeah. I mean, some of those children too, though, will ultimately decide that they want to go back, because what's going to happen if you don't have anyone here in the United States?
What does
I mean,
happen? You go
well,
back.
Well, I mean, you can go into the URM program, and you can, if you have some way to get status, you can get status, you can stay in that program, and eventually go out on your own, and you're eventually released from that program. So you can stay here, but I think it's just much harder because you don't really have that support system that most of these kids hopefully create.
And of the, let's say the 60,000 that come across, how many are going back to their home country eventually, whether it's in 1 year or 2 years? Or...
So I don't know what the percentage is.
What do you think?
But I think it's very low.
Oh, okay.
I think it's probably very low. But it's a different question than how many of them end up with removal orders.
Right.
It's
just
it's how many of them
actuality, right?
actually end up.
So there are a
Yeah.
lot more kids in the U.S. that should be going back, or that the government thinks should be going back, than are going back.
Right. I mean, and we hear, it's not uncommon for us to hear stories for children who have actually been deported, coming back over. I mean,
Yeah.
we've seen a number of children who have been deported. A lot of children, not a lot, but so we have an agreement with, that children who are from contiguous countries can be, they're subject to expedited removal. So they're basically turned back around. So if you're a child from Mexico and you are apprehended, you're immediately sent back to Mexico. So we have kids who are not necessarily Mexican nationals, but might say that they're Mexican nationals and get sent back to Mexico, and then they just come right back over.
Let me ask you another little question, and then we'll give you a big round of applause. So having spent a lot of time on the border, you would always find at some of these little centers, the resettlement centers or whatever, in the United States, you'd find a significant number of Cubans, right? Because Cubans always were able to come across, unlike any other
Yeah.
people from any other country. What is the general feeling in the immigration community now that that law has changed and Cubans are like everyone else? It's sort of a mixed feeling, isn't it?
So, yeah, and I'll tell you though, and truthfully, and with unaccompanied children, in our little small
Yeah.
world, we've
It-
never
no
really been
impact.
talking about Cubans,
Yeah,
right?
no
Because it
impact.
doesn't impact our work
Yeah.
directly, yeah.
Yeah, so any sort of thoughts though around that? It's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a good response for that
Yeah.
one.
Because if you're from Mexico or Salvador, you're like, well, it's about time that they're the same as us.
Right.
But if you're Cuban, you're like, what happened?
And for like the population that we're working with, I don't know that they actually recognize that there ever was a difference,
Oh, yeah.
right? So.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, very good. Big hand for Liz, guys.